Welcome to ENG-AGE International Webinar on Literature and Theory. And welcome to all of our guests today, our special guests, and our audience today, and our well-wishers from Jamia Madinatul Noor institutions and from Collins Publishers. So a good evening for all of our attendees today, and good morning too. We have attendees from US and beyond, so it's in fact a transnational one. So today we have this ENG-AGE program centered based on this topic and voices from peripheries, new trends in literary theory and literature. So in fact, I felt like problematizing the way we termed the word periphery, because it's a kind of reifying, essentializing the existing inequality that we see today in the world. And it seems to me that at first, but in fact, there is a lot more possibility in dealing with that word, in terming it that way, because these peripheries, in fact, consequential, a reality indeed. It is an existing reality in the world, and we cannot do away with that word overnight, all of a sudden, in such a fleeting moment of self-realization. So we cannot do away with that. So this is a reality that we are facing today. We are fighting against it. So we have to use. I think I prefer using it in a problem word, because this is something that we need to change. Periphery is not the place we should sit always. So, you know, this periphery, this geographical and theoretical word is in fact, it often makes sense only when it's used in such a condition that it is useful for understanding the dominant other. So this is a mentality that we have grown, that is grown out of our condition of living in such a international literary world that is informed by the supposed universality of a canonical literature. But we have this peripheral literature beyond us, within us, and peripheral theory within us. So, you know, this peripheral representation, in fact, it seems to me that artistically and politically is a challenging one, because it's twice removed from center. It's fighting against limited opportunities of expression, and it's fighting against the self-assumed images of minority by the dominant ones. So it's twice removed from center. So this webinar today, the ENG-AGE webinars, we are doing this investigation of such a significantly important one, because firstly, due to its defiance of the dominant one, the dominant other, and secondly, in its capacity of being the bearer of the subjugated reality that we are facing today, which is a hidden one, but is consequently a real one. So the webinar today embraces the experiences of these deterritorialized people, the refugees, the marginalized ethnicities, and the identity crisis of the diaspora. We are in fact addressing those people, and even the peripheral within the peripheral, because if you think of the Indian English literature, which is we have a narrow past, patronized by the elites from metropolitan cities like Kolkata, Bangalore, Delhi, and Mumbai. But we have people from the peripheries, from Dalit perspective, from a different marginal and indigenous perspective, speaking about the Indian English literature. We have this Hasna Shuman Shaga, who is a literary personality, a poet from the Santal Pagana in Bihar. She's an Adivaisi writer. And there is, even in Kerala, we have the Chandra Mohan Satyanandan, who is a literary personality from Kerala, writing from an indigenous perspective. And recently, even Ajmal Babu, who is a lecturer in Ashoka University, is writing about the literary the literary works and even writing about the experiences. It is such a passionate experiences of the Mapala Muslims, which is an indigenous community in Kerala. So we have such people. But that said, these themes and these personalities still fail to make it to the front pew of the literary canon, fail to make it to the mainstream literary debates and literary discourses. But what I could see that one of the things that I could see today is that these personalities are synonymous with the political. Their writings, their circumstances is synonymous with the political and the theoretical and the literary circumstances of that affected, that unsettled, that orchestrated the works of the Dalit poet, the Black American poets, the literary personality from South America, and even the decolonial literary personalities from Agha Shahid Ali and Mahmoud Darwish, Khalil Gibran, James Baldwin, and Milan Kundera. And Milan Kundera has a very interesting visualizing about the importance, the significance of this peripheral voice in literature. He used to say, I remember the work, he used to say that the first step in the liquidating a people, the first step in liquidating a people's culture is to erase his memory. Destroy his books and his culture and history, and then have someone write a new history, manufacture a new culture, write a new book. Now, so before long, this nation, this society will begin to forget about what it is and what it was. So this is how the absence of the erasure of the peripheral voice affects the literary field, the culture, and even the livelihoods of the everyday self-making of the people, of the marginal people we are living with and even we are a part of. So this ENG-AGE webinar is in fact a project, is a long drawn project to deal with that question. And we have been conducting, this program is in fact the last in line of such programs that we are conducting in the literary field, dealing with the peripheral voices. We have been conducting national seminars all through this year, and for at least almost 3 months we have been conducting this such national webinars dealing with the multilingual translations, South Asian literature, post-colonial literature in general. So so this is what we have been conducting, and for the knowledge of our audiences today, this program is conducted by the Department of English, Jamia Madinat Noor, which is an autonomous institution of Marcus institutions based in Calicut in Kerala, and is done in collaboration with the renowned Collins publishers in India. So Marcus is an institution, in fact, continuously, constantly transforming the educational, academic, and social circumstance, social upliftment of the minority children in particular, and the society as a whole in general. In Kerala, beyond the state, in other states of India, and beyond the nation, is of campuses. So they have a bunch of institutions dealing with these questions, dealing with questions in humanities, commercial and scientific fields, and we have been conducting such webinars and conferences all through this year. So to the knowledge of our audiences today, if you want to know, if you could take note, if you want to know much about this institution, you could visit our brochures and our website. We have a website known as www.marcus.in, and there is a website www.marcusgarden.org, which is our official website, and you could it would immensely help to get in tune with us in our future academic endeavors and projects. So we have a very talented, such an excellent and talented scholars today in their field, such an aspiring quality, and we are very fortunate enough to have them in such an inspiring circumstance. We are dealing with such a pandemic. So today we'll have four speakers. We have Professor Brian Wagner, associate and a senior professor at California University, Berkeley, and we have Supradeep Dasgupta, who is an assistant professor at University of North Bengal, and we have Professor Kian Pishka, who is a professor at the Islamic Azad University, Iran, and we have a renowned one, Tariq Mahmoud Ali, who is associate professor at American University of Beirut, who is based in UK. He'll be speaking from UK today. So. Do we have our director of the institution here to speak to start the inaugural? Do we have it? So, I mean, there is inconvenience that we are facing. Bear with us today. So before moving on to this, our sessions and our speakers today, so we'll have an inaugural talk provided by, we'll be joined by Dr. Amej Hazhari, who is the director of the institution, Jamia Madinat Noor, and he'll be here soon. Okay, director is facing some technical difficulties today. So I think he'll join us. He will join us soon. So before that, let me, I have already introduced you about the institutions that is hosting this one, and also the Collins Publishers, one of the renowned co-publishers, a subsidiary, one of the HarperCollins, famous one. So today, we'll move on to the sessions, and our director will talk in between because he's facing some technical problems. So I could see Professor Brian Wagner. He's here. He's in fact a senior professor at English department at University of California, Berkeley, and is in fact a renowned author of many works that has been published, that has come with Harvard University Press, Prince Aaron University Press, and recently in the last year through Bloomsbury. And so he is currently researching about the African-American expression in the context of slavery and its aftermath, and is doing also an archival work. He's a part of a collaborative digital archive, Louisiana Slave Conspiracies. So, Professor, I think we could start with Professor Brian Wagner on his topic, the life of a fugitive slave. Professor Brian Wagner is here. Hope you're fine, Professor.
Hello, hello. Thank you for having me. Good evening to you. It's an honor. It's an honor to be with you all.
So I think you could start it first.
Yes. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen because I have some images I would like to show with you all. Sometimes this can be tricky, but I think will work. Let's see. Is that working?
Sure. It's clear.
Okay, it's clear. Okay, good enough. Okay, so today I'm gonna tell you all a story about a fugitive slave. It's a story that begins in a very particular time and place, but it encompasses a lot. You know, it's a story that encompasses the history of American and African-American literature, folklore, music, and the history of the police power in the United States. It's a story that begins in 1836. So in the time of slavery in the United States, in New Orleans, a city, metropolis by the mouth of the Mississippi River. And it's about a particular fugitive slave who is known as Bras Coupé, which is actually a French name. It means severed arm. So bras means arm and coupé means severed. It's a story based on this book, the cover of which you can see on your screen. The subtitle tells you something about his interests. It's the fugitive slave who fought the law, ruled the swamp, danced at Congo Square, invented jazz, and died for love. The historical person did not necessarily do all of these things, but in his legend, he did. And so I'll be telling you both about his life in the 1830s, but also his legend, which takes us forward all the way into the 20th century. So again, we're starting though in a very particular time and place. This is a map of New Orleans in the 1830s. You can see near the bottom of the map the city by the Mississippi River. Behind the city, up to the lake here, is swampland. So swamp that is now filled in. That's now part of the city, but in the 19th century was not yet enclosed. This relationship between the city and the swamp is very important to the story I'll be telling, because all the way back into the 18th century, there were communities of fugitive slaves who lived in the swamp. So slaves who had escaped from their masters in the city of New Orleans to found their own communities, autonomous communities that were hunting and fishing and growing squash and rice, reproducing over generations. We call these fugitive communities maroon communities. Bras Coupé was one of the Maroons. Over time, there were many years and decades when there was a relatively peaceful relationship between the Maroons and the city of New Orleans. There was trade, and there was a kind of relative peace. There were also times when the relationship between the city and the swamp would result in warfare. The fugitive slaves in the swamp, people in the city believed, were tempting away slaves from the city into their communities. The 1830s was a time of warfare, and Bras Coupé was one of the leaders in that war. So the story begins, though, at a very particular time in January of 1836, when Bras Coupé was shot by a police officer in the swamp and was taken to the hospital in the city. You can see here actually the police record at the bottom here. His name when he was a slave is Squire. This is an account of his being shot by the police. He was brought to a hospital in order to be nursed back to health and returned to his second-story window and returns to the swamp. It sounds amazing. This is true. What I'm telling you. From that point, his character changed in some ways. He started to lead some raids against the city. Stealing from people and stores on the boundary between the city and the swamp. And he became quite famous in the city. There were wanted posters put up for him. The newspapers in the city were focused in particular on Bras Coupé as a danger, a person symbolizing the danger emanating from the fugitive slaves in the swamp. That campaign against Bras Coupé is actually very interesting because something else was happening in the city of New Orleans at this time. In January 1836, the same week that Bras Coupé jumps out of that hospital window, the New Orleans City Council voted to demilitarize its police department. In particular, they voted to take the guns away from the police. The United States now, we're having lots of conversations about defunding and otherwise de-escalating policing. This is something that the city of New Orleans took very seriously in 1836. It was a controversial measure then, as it is also a controversial measure now. The mayor of the city, Dennis Prior, was opposed to this idea. And there was an ongoing argument that was happening over 1836 and 1837 when Bras Coupé was at large in the swamp. One of the ways in which the mayor and his allies in the police department decided to advance their argument of the importance of police bearing guns was to focus on the intense threat posed by Bras Coupé and his band of fugitive slaves. The argument they made implicitly was, if you take the guns away from the police, who will defend you against Bras Coupé citizens? So this is the beginning then of the legend that I'm telling you. Interestingly, it's a legend that comes into existence as the product of state propaganda, right? The product of propaganda arguing for the necessity of police having guns, the necessity of a state monopoly on violence, even. So this is very important. There's a lot that happens in the next 2 years as Bras Coupé and his band in the swamp are battling the police department. By July of the following year, Bras Coupé is finally captured after he is double-crossed by one of his acquaintances, and his body, in quite gruesome fashion, is displayed here in the Place d'Armes, now called Jackson Square in New Orleans, in front of St. Louis Cathedral for a week. It's a matter of legend that the slaves living in the city were ordered to march by his body to witness it as a kind of warning. This is then the end of his historical life, and there are ways in which his body being hung in effigy, you can see as a kind of emblem of police power, an emblem of sovereignty in the city. It's also right across from City Hall here. So the office of Dennis Prier, the mayor, is right across from where his body was hung in effigy. Crucially, though, his story doesn't end there, because people in the city, slaves in the city in particular, started telling stories about Bras Coupé. If Bras Coupé appears in the newspapers of 1836 and 1837 as a villain, as someone against whom the police are fighting in a just war against the swamp, in a lot of the folklore that we have that started to be recorded in the subsequent decades, he's actually a hero, right? So there are many stories that are told about him, an oral tradition about Bras Coupé that emerges in the decades subsequent to his death. You can almost imagine his being hung in effigy as kind of launching this tradition in folklore. The tales that we have transcribed are fascinating. People often say that Bras Coupé had magical powers, that his body could not be punctured by bullets, that he could, if you looked him in the eyes, that he would turn you to stone, that he could breathe fire. There's even, this is actually relevant to us, there's even a particular tale that recounts police officers chasing him around a corner in a swamp. They're caught in a dust storm and then emerge in India. So they have, there's actually a connection there. So this oral tradition is fascinating and important, and not least important because it serves as a kind of reflection, a vernacular reflection on the argument that was being had about the relationship between policing and slavery in the United States at that time. If it's a story with an oral tradition, a vernacular tradition, it's also a story with a literary tradition. In 1880, one of the most important expressions of the legend of Bras Coupé appears in this novel by George Washington Cable. This is the most, there are many versions of the legend. This is the most influential. And Cable, importantly, changes the story, okay, in several ways. I'll explain three of them to you all. The first is that he says that Bras Coupé was an African prince. He follows precedents, Cable, the author does, in representing Bras Coupé as a prince from Africa who was enslaved. If you all know the book Orinoco by Afro-American, a British book published in 1688, that's a kind of origin of a British tradition of anti-slavery concerned with captive kings and princes. Cable adopts and adapts that convention. He also does something very strange, which is that he restores Bras Coupé's missing arm. This is an illustration from a later edition of the novel. You can see Bras Coupé here has two arms. Cable says that the name is symbolic rather than literal. He also makes a really important change by saying that Bras Coupé was the most famous dancer at Congo Square. Congo Square is a place in New Orleans that is very important and well known as a site where slaves would gather to drum and dance and sing on Sundays. This is important because through the United States, for much of the 19th century, these kinds of musical and artistic traditions were forbidden. This is one site where they were allowed to be performed en masse. And so we think of Congo Square as an incredibly important place in the history of African cultural retentions in the New World, so-called, in the United States, where traditions that eventually become jazz and blues and other popular musics that then diffuse throughout the world, they're really crucially transferred through this site of Congo Square. And Cable says that the best dancer at Congo Square was Bras Coupé. He talks a lot about Bras Coupé's prowess as a drummer and dancer. This is, as best we can tell, a fiction, though. So Bras Coupé, the historical maroon in the swamp, may have gone to Congo Square, may have danced and drummed, but was not a kind of legendary central figure that Cable makes him out to be. This is complicated, though, because in the legend, people like this idea of him being this preeminent drummer and inspiring dancer. And so from this point on, this becomes part of his story. It's a part of his story, though, that again begins with a novel rather than a history in the 1830s. So you then get things like, for instance, this opera, which is first performed in Germany and then in France and England by Frederick Delius. About Bras Coupé, that talks about him as an African prince, talks about him as a famous dancer. You also have in the 20th century other kinds of expressions. For instance, a Hollywood movie starring Clark Gable called Band of Angels, adapted from a novel by Robert Penn Warren, again adapting this legend in new ways. This is Sidney Poitier here playing Bras Coupé. You'll notice Sidney Poitier with two arms. Based on Cable's novel. You also, crucially, have a historical tradition. This is a book of history by Herbert Asbury, published in 1836, that tells the story of the history of Bras Coupé. However, it tells the story of the history of Bras Coupé in ways that merge together fact and fiction, right? So, for instance, his account, Herbert Asbury's historical account, begins with a scene at Congo Square at which Bras Coupé is the most inspiring singer and dancer. Okay, so here we see how Cable's fiction has been mixed with facts to tell a story not only about the history of policing in the United States, but also about the history of Black music in the United States. This is especially important because in the wake of this history, a lot of the first generation of jazz histories take Asbury at his word, and they talk about, when they're talking about the origins of jazz in New Orleans, they talk about Bras Coupé. Sometimes they don't name him, but they refer to Asbury and they talk about one singer and dancer at the center of Congo Square, who in Asbury's account is Bras Coupé, and they talk about him as an inspiration to the first generation of jazz musicians. And so this includes in particular Buddy Bolden, someone who has never recorded, but in works like Shining Trumpets or Robert Goffin's Jazz or Jasmine, this collection, or this book by Barry Ulanoff, it's the case that Bras Coupé is identified as directly inspiring Buddy Bolden to play his cornet in the way that he does. So this is an interesting thing, because this is again a kind of accidental history that has been developed here, a combination of fact and fiction, a combination of a kind of emblem launched by state propaganda to become a folkloric hero, to become a fictional character responsible for the communication of African cultural and musical practices into the New World, bringing all these things together in kind of an extraordinary way. In the histories here, though, it's actually important that following Cable, Bras Coupé is not a leader of the Maroons and the fugitive slaves in the battle against the police department. This gradually, over the course of this history, drops out to focus on Bras Coupé as a great singer and dancer. This is important because one of the most profound, I think maybe the most profound expression of this history is in an autobiography by the clarinet and soprano saxophone player Sidney Bechet, published in 1960. There are several really extraordinary lyrical autobiographies written by jazz musicians. This is among the most lyrical and extraordinary. It's also the case that Bechet, we know, enjoyed telling a good story, enjoyed stretching the truth in various ways in order to tell a particular story about the history of jazz music in the city of New Orleans. One of his most extraordinary inventions in this book is to claim that Bras Coupé, he renames Omar, was his grandfather. We know that Bras Coupé, in fact, was not his grandfather, that he was, in fact, annexing the legend of Bras Coupé to his own life history, but he is doing this this kind of invented genealogy for a profound purpose, right? Because what Bechet does is he takes that story about Bra Coupé inventing jazz at Congo Square. He actually literally says that, rather than telling the story in the way that jazz history generally did, where Bra Coupé inspires somebody else, like say Buddy Bolden, to take away the inspiration of Congo Square and invent jazz. Bechet says that it was his grandfather who invented jazz at Congo Square. He invented it even before, in the morning before he went. He was already playing jazz, it is said. And so this is an extraordinary variation already, right? You know, in attributing to this legendary fugitive slave the invention of the jazz tradition. But Bechet doesn't stop there, because he tells that story, but then he returns to the legend of Bra Coupé all of these aspects that had previously disappeared. So the battle between the Maroons and the police in the swamps, you know, the gangs of dogs and police searching for Bra Coupé in the swamp, the loss of the arm, right? Remember that for so much of this history, Bra Coupé's missing arm, an injury he had sustained at the hands of the police, had been erased. Cable had restored his arm. Bechet, as he tells the story, talks about Bra Coupé losing his arm, talks about the community of Maroons in the swamp. So what he does, which is really fascinating and imaginative and powerful, is to retell the story of the origin of jazz in the context of the battle between fugitive slaves and the police in the swamp in New Orleans in the 1830s. He restores, in other words, to the history of jazz a kind of social and political context that insists upon the necessity of imagining the music's emergence under conditions of slavery, right, in the United States, producing a kind of myth that takes all of the different layers and levels of the legend of Bra Coupé and integrates them, right, in order to, again, invent a genealogy for his own musical practice that insists upon this broad understanding that, again, grounds us back in a story of warfare between fugitive slaves and the officials of the state government in New Orleans. So what I tried to do in this book is to gather together a lot of materials to kind of tell this story. So a lot of the book is actually an anthology of these primary sources, beginning with newspapers and police records, treasurer's records, records from the mayor's office in the 1830s, moving up through all of these examples, through the opera, through the novel, through various histories, finally to Bechet's extraordinary lyrical presentation in Treat It Gentle, his autobiography, in order to make available for people, the kind of primary materials related to this legend, which to my mind is not well enough known. Many people in the United States, many people in New Orleans do not know this story, which ties together, again, so much of our history. The oral tradition all the way up through Bechet, what's so profound about it, I think, is the ways in which it attempts to think about questions of culture and politics in an integrated way. The ways in which it, again, insists upon understanding a musical tradition, a cultural tradition that stretches back from Africa as taking on powerful political significance in its evolving context. So I think I'll stop there with that presentation. I'll be very excited to hear the other speakers today. And again, thank you so much for including me in this panel. I'm excited to be here talking with you all.
Thanks, Professor, for such a outstanding talk. Is in fact dealing with different questions that is in fact seem like outlandish to our lives and many people who are living in the eastern part of the world. And even in Europe, it can sometimes feel outlandish. So this is in fact a narrative of such an marginal literary personality, such a literary character. So it was in fact with such an analytical sophistication, but such an astonishing lucidity too. So we have, thanks again, Professor Brian Wagner, and sure, we'll have a lot more questions, and I mean, participants will have a lot more questions, and if we have any doubts, any questions, something to clear the doubts, something to fill the gaps, it's convenient for them. I think since we do not have questions sessions in between the speakers, I think it would be quite good for them if they take use of the question answer button on the bottom of your screen, so that you could text in, you could drop in your questions and your doubts regarding each session with your name or with your designation, along with the speaker who you address this question to. So you could text it to me, and our organizers would collect it, and I would air the compelling questions to our speakers at the end of this sessions in the questions discussion sessions that we are waiting for. We are anxiously waiting for. So we have next Professor Tariq Mahmoud Ali, who is a senior professor, associate professor at American University of Beirut, and is in is a senior professor at American University of Beirut, and he is based in UK, and he's a renowned documentary maker, filmmaker, and is a novelist, and his novels has been published in Penguin Books, and his recent, I think, recent one known as Injustice, which has won award-winning, is a co-editor of that documentary, which is an award-winning one, and is one of the acclaimed documentaries of the 20th century. So we have Tariq Mahmoud speaking about the decolonization of the imagination and the imperial, the linguistic imperialism. So welcome. So.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm sorry you've had a few technological problems, but we live in an era of problems. You know, sometimes I find words liberating, and other times I find myself imprisoned by them. I'm going to take you on a journey myself, about myself, and hopefully we will look at these complex questions like the decolonization of the mind and linguistic imperialism, or at least they sound complex, and yet they're not in any way have any form of complexity as far as I think. So I'm going to share with you my screen. I don't do very many of these screen shares, and take you on a journey with me, and hopefully we will share a story together. Well, the story I'm going to share with you, because I'm discussing the question of the decolonization of the imagination and linguistic imperialism, is nothing complicated and academic. It's born out of my own life, the life of my family, my friends, where I come from. And I'm going to talk to you about the struggle for my own mother tongue. Then I'm going to take you on a little journey of my teaching and how I found the question of the colonization very difficult to deal with. So perhaps I'll begin with asking you to bear a question in mind, to which I'll return right at the very end. What would a colonized imagination look like to you? How would you think? What would your mind be like? What would linguistic imperialism, you think, be expressed? Would it just be in the imperial language, or some of its legacies. So bear these questions in mind, and let's go into my story. You are in the southern tip of South Asia, southern tip of India. I was born in Pakistan. If you look on the map, where India ends, Pakistan begins, where Kashmir begins, you go across the mountains into northern Punjab. And I was born there in quite a long time ago now. And one of the things I found very difficult as a child was having to learn my schooling in Urdu. Now, overwhelming majority of the people in our villages are now Muslims because of the partition of 1947. And I didn't make anything of it. I accepted this to be the norm. And as I grew older, I went over, I migrated to Manchester. There I began to ask fundamental questions. And I returned, why do I can't write in my own language? Why does my mother talk to me in this? And so on. And when I got older, I returned to my village. By then I was part of the founding fathers of the language movement, our own language movement. I will tell you about it in a little while. And I came to my village, and there was a young boy trying, if those of you who understand how Muslim children are taught to read the Quran, certainly in my part of the woods, you will see we rock backwards and forwards, trying to memorize the Arabic script, the Arabic words. Of course, we don't understand the meaning. We feel the meaning of the Arabic perhaps, but we certainly didn't understand what we were reading. And this boy was preparing for his science exams. Now, this was an amazing boy. He could dig the wild herbs out of the ground. He knew the name of every tree, every berry. He could hunt for wild honey by just looking at the bees and which way they flew. And yet he couldn't memorize the very basic thing that he was trying to learn. And it was simply, where are roots? Where the roots come from in Urdu. Jaden kahan hoti hain? He would just memorize, going backwards. I called him over and I said, what are you doing? He goes, I'm trying to memorize my sabak, I can't understand it. So I asked him in his own language, where are roots? He goes, well, where do you think roots are, uncle? They're in the ground. I says, that's all your sabak, that's all your lesson. He couldn't do it. It really affected me, to tell you, it affected me so much that I began to look back at myself, that really I had always grown up thinking that mine was a language of junglies, i.e. wild beasts out there. It had no worth, it was crude, and at school, people like the kid I just described, and to a lesser extent, me, it was beaten out of us by our teachers. And I mean, those of you from South Asia may recognize this position. In the Punjab, we call it the cooker position. If you spoke in Urdu at school, in my part of the woods, and perhaps it's still the case now, the teacher would force you into that, get a cane or a strip or something, and wallop you on your backside just to ensure that you did not speak in your own, you did not speak in your mother tongue, but spoke in the medium of education, and that being Urdu at the time. Now, so that there is no confusion, I have nothing against Urdu or any other language for that matter, including the one I speak and which I'm at times critical of. So I went to England. And my mother remained in Pakistan. She would write to me in Urdu, and I went about the age of 7 to 9. She would write to me in Urdu, but she never spoke to me in Urdu. She spoke to me in Pothohari, or Pahari as it is also called. Some of us call it Punjabi as well. So in a way, she spoke to me in Pothohari, wrote to me in Urdu. By then, I couldn't read very much Urdu. I was very little. And I wrote back to her in English. So her letters to me were being translated in another language. My letters to her were being translated in another language, and let alone the wall of separation between us. The linguistic wall was perhaps far deeper, for I could never have an intimacy of love, even in a letter. I could only feel its feeling. Well, I began to think about life. You know, those of us from South Asia, especially, or anyone who's watched the Hindi movies, you will know there's a particular class amongst us, this mummy, daddy, pinky class, you know, and there's no shortage in Pakistan for that matter. Observing people of that nature, not just in films, but in my own family and friends, I began to realize that there was a very clear-cut class division, which was also affecting me. English was at the top, Urdu was below, Punjabi was below, and my mother tongue was below that. At this stage, I hadn't quite understood all the connections that would tell me that it is not just a simple matter, but there are other processes involved, that languages aren't just a conjunction of words. They have deeply embedded in cultures, in histories, in politics, in conquest and resistance. But I learned that very quickly when I got to Bradford. In Bradford, Northern England, I became a Paki. All of a sudden, my skin became, an object of hatred. Violence was performed. But the devaluation of our language and culture was even great. We didn't really exist. There was racism on the playground. In resisting against the racism on the playground, it acted as a key that unlocked a whole series of doors for me. I began to understand that racism was not skin deep. It was deeply embedded in colonial history of Europe, in slavery, and the resistance to it was also as component a part of shaping history as was itself. And all these were products of colonialism. And as things moved on, I came across to the seminal work of Ngugi, in particular, his Decolonizing the Mind. And here, when I listened and read Ngugi and came across his ideas, that actually the colonial conquest that had given birth to me, and I am of Kashmiri ancestry. I was sold in 1846, as well as South Asia was colonized by the British. There were untold numbers of swords that fell across us, but language was just as much a sword as colonial conquest. And we began to look deeper into this question. How is it that our mother tongue is one, our medium of education is another? And suddenly we realized that colonial requirements needed a division between the people at the bottom and those they ruled. And here, for one part, Urdu would form a role. On the other hand, as I said earlier on, the position of Urdu in India and Pakistan is not the same, nor is it all the things. And I share with you how clear this was a reference to the British colonial policy. So moving fairly quickly forward, looking at the great work of Ngugi, analyzing our own selves, that really those amongst us who had a little bit of money always insisted speaking in a different language, and the speaking of a different language and even insulting us meant that we were denying the existence of tens of millions of people, their culture, their history, their songs, their dreams, and that was unacceptable. So a group of us migrants got together, and we were in England. Our language had no newspapers in it, no magazines in it. It was not taught in any school. And for your viewers, in Punjab, it is still not the mother tongue of education, and in the Pakistani-controlled part of Kashmir as well. So we started off a humble A4 paper called Chitka bilingually to put our writing in prose, that it wasn't actually that difficult to write. Now, so we had some great successes. Television stations got formed. People before us, of course, were writing mostly poetry, TV dramas and things. We became the movement produced novelists, playwrights, film scripts, all sorts of things emerged out of movement. But along the road, we were heavily criticized by Pakistani nationalists for being anti-Pakistani. Kashmiri nationalists, in some cases, called us anti-Kashmiri. The Punjabis said we were, some Punjabis, not all, said we were divisive, and ours was a dialect. And of course, we fought back. We fought back. against this by explaining things that what constitutes a dialect and a language or political divisions. And here I draw your attention to the very famous quote from, I believe it's The Joy of Yiddish. And in the main, people said that ours was a retrogressive, backward-looking concept where we wanted education to be, the medium of education to be in the mother tongue. Anyway, to cut my story very quickly, we also wanted to translate the Holy Quran into our language because we felt that that would be one of the quickest ways of also eliminating illiteracy, given the fact that most people could read the Holy Quran and at least some aspects of the Arabic script. And given the medium of education in the northern part of South Asia for us was in the Arabic-based scripts, we started translating and just finishing this thing. One day, a load of bearded men turned up at my house in Manchester, threatened to beat me up on the basis that we were translating the Holy Quran into a language that was obscene by its speech, by its existence. Unlucky for these bearded fellas, there was about 15 of us in the room and there were only 5 of us, 5 of them. So let me now move very quickly forward into the thing, and I share with you my next set of stories, and I promise I'll leave it on a much lighter note when I finish, that I've begun to realize that colonialism may have left India and Pakistan, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, but its legacy is far, far from over. And in a sense, English may be the medium through which we are communicating, but actually it also comes on the backs of linguistic carnage. And because English imperialism and imperialism by the English also affected not just one, but dozens of our languages. And in essence,
I wanted to speak about Black heroism.
I was getting a little bit interrupted there. In essence, I would like to say, finish on this section and take you on to my next part of the journey, that in essence, the idea of imperialism is about exploitation, about a group of people who benefit from something, and language is no difference. So in conclusion of this story, there are many contradictions. As I said earlier on, Urdu in Pakistan is not the same as Urdu and the way it is being treated in India. Now we should also, as the Hindification of India takes place, and as those of you who are keeping your mind on the ground, you can see the imposition of Kashmir, the Hindi script and the Hindi language of order. It has nothing to do with the population of that region whatsoever. And the India of today should remember the lessons of Pakistan's imposition of Urdu on the then East Pakistan. And all those of you who don't know should know that that is where the international mother tongue came, when Bengali youth refused to see the destruction and the imposition of Urdu upon themselves. Now, let me slow you down a little bit and come in to Beirut. And here I'd like to really come to the inspiring words of Chandra Mohan. I was going to talk a little bit more, and I was hoping to delve into some of the questions, very pertinent questions he raises in terms of the relationship of caste and the appropriation of language, particularly the Brahminicalization of some of the aspects of the culture and the resistance to it. But let me just share this, because this resonates so much in my writing, because I live in England, and the never ending in the association in UK and Europe and America with Islamophobia, this newish form of racism, where terrorism equals Islam, equals Muslims, and even Muslim lookalikes. Please keep this in mind. I'll be ending on this, and you may enjoy my story on this. Now, why I write, and sometimes, mostly I write in English, but really Maya Angelou's amazing words really capture the moment that all of us have a wonderful story. Each of us have the desire to tell it. We should tell our story. It is the story of humanity, and it all deserves to be told. And until we tell it, we can't really find peace. But who is we? Who is to tell our story? Here I am guided by the next proverb. If the lion doesn't write its story, it becomes the story of the hunter. And as a man of color who grew up in a white world, my norm was that of a white norm. And the mummy daddy papu class had ensured that my norm was also not the norm born out of the scents and smells of my villages and my own cultures, but one that had been imposed on us. And the final quote on our voices is from my very good friend, who says that he writes a science fiction type of a world because if he can't recapture the past, he can certainly get to the future. Now, I go to Beirut and I teach predominantly my students are West Asians, mostly Arabs. And I wanted them, and I teach fiction as well, to be fictionally visible themselves. But you know, no matter how hard I tried, many of my students end up trying to create white characters, do not value their work, completely Americanize. I give examples that many a time I've worked so hard, but somehow I found it very difficult to get the students to think about valuing their own experiences in Beirut, in Lebanon, in the Levant. I mean, how can anyone say? I started asking around my friends. I said, look, I'm really tired and frustrated. And my good friend, Professor Danish Mustafa from King's College London, said to me that, you know, my students have active imagination. They're very clever. They can imagine alternative universes, create art and software, freaky aliens, sublime music, end of the world, and even God, but not the end of capitalism or a world without it. Here lies the depth of the colonization of our imaginations, that we begin to think every norm of today is normal for eternity. It is not. Now, these are some of the stories I am unable to discuss with you due to the lack of time. Hence, I referred to the great work of Chandra Mohan. Perhaps you should read it. But the reclaiming of language, reclaiming of our spoken languages, our written languages is here now. Coming to the end, I started with you. I didn't know whether I am sometimes oppressed by words, sometimes liberated by them. And I'm going to just come to the end. And in here, my son, I grew up in Bradford in the 1976. And in Bradford, a white boy came up to me and he said, "Oi, mate, speak some Paki." And I said, "What?" He said, "Speak some Paki." I said, "Oh, come on, give me a break. Go away." My son, who is now 19, he was going for a walk in the park in Manchester. My event was 76. He is 2016. He's in a park and a white boy comes up to him and says, "Oi, speak some Muslim. Please, come on, I want to hear some Muslim." As absurd as it may sound, my son was very upset. I said, "What did you say to him?" He said, "Well, first I swore at him, but then I said, go away." He wasn't being aggressive. He just wanted to hear some Muslim. So I said, "What did you do?" My son said, "I went boom, boom." And I think it was probably the most appropriate of an answer that a young man could have given our complete association with the concept of terrorism. Now, I'm going to conclude and end here. I'd like you to imagine flying from Kerala, thousands of miles to my village, and from there back to Beirut, at the tip of Western Asia, and to Manchester. We will fly over thousands of speeches and languages and stories, many of them held down by powers that be, some in pretense of religion, some by the powerful, and some still struggling to be born. And I will end my talk today on the words of my father when I asked him about, my language and how he thought about it. And he said, "Our language, we come from the hill tracts of the bottom of the Himalayas. He says, our language is like the water of the wells of our village. Each has its own beautiful taste. And I think here we should be celebrating the existence of 1,000 flowers, not trying to impose one or two. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Tariq Mahmoud, Professor. Is such a class that such a poignant story that we were working with Tariq Mahmoud sir, because this is I recently came with some sort of ethno-drama in which the researchers use these dramatical methods in ethnography. So, in fact, I see these professors, Tariq sir's class, in fact, doing that way, moving on with the audience. I mean, it's not like we are moving on with Tariq. Tariq is in fact moving on with us. So we have thanks, sir. So we have our next speaker, Professor Kian Pishka, is in fact assistant professor at Islamic Azad University, Iran, and is also the head of postgraduate Department of English Language and Literature in the Giraf branch of Islamic Azad University in Iran. So he'll talk about another significant topic, an important one, the gendered diaspora of the post-colonial Iranian nodes. Welcome, sir.
Thank you for inviting, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, I wanted to speak about the lack of Black heroine in modern American and postmodern American literature, but I have been asked to speak about postmodern diaspora of Iranian literature, which has been written after 1979, after Islamic Revolution in Iran. I love to study and investigate about the diaspora literature and identity that I call it. And diaspora is connected with quest and identity. In Iranian literature, diaspora is always after revolution. Islamic revolution is so important because we have so many immigrants in United States and Europe after revolution, I mean. And most of them were educated and intellectual people that try to displace his home. And because of this, they try to have new kind of situation, new kind of experience for their literature and their literary experience and for their life. Always diaspora is the reflection of identity that takes place when identity continues to occupy center stage, not only in the literary, cultural, and studies, but also in humanities. In general, I always say that while being subjected to various critical as well as contextual assaults, this contextual assault is so important because they have so many critical and crucial situations that they try to change it, but maybe they couldn't because of any kind of the determinism, any kind of the social situations or political situation. All of them can cause this. This same situation impact of the history and politics, which had, that prepared issues of national and regional identity. Because after displacement, we have this kind of the problem that they should adapt themselves, that they should cope themselves with new situation and find new regional identity from that can connect it to a kind of the post-colonial studies now starting that undermine this situation. If not validity of such categories in diasporic histories, studies, as a new phenomenon, I wanted to share some pictures. Unfortunately, if I can, I will show that some special ones.
There is a screen sharing option. You could do that.
Okay, and unfortunately, I couldn't do this. The first fictional migrant narrative, as you know, the narrative in English is the immigrants show that shift in relationship between person's identity, not social identity. Here is so important that we emphasize on personal identity, sense of the place, how they adapt themselves, how they adjust themselves with new place in another part of the world that is not their real home. Sharing of this situation and circumstances provide always a kind of temporary stay against disorder as long as immigrants remain with those boundaries beyond in unfamiliar England, different from their expectations. They have to make new identities. This new identity is a kind of the determinism that we believe that social situation, geographical situation, or religious situation imposed to them, and they should adapt themselves with that. And these new identities in new place or risk of estrangement because they are alienation there. They are a kind of the strangers. They are kind of the foreigners that the situation must accept them. This situation, as I said, can be political, can be social, can be geographical, and all of them has a kind of the relationship that they should adopt themselves with these situations. People, and at the beginning of this new millennium, a new phase of mass movement of the people creating new diasporas, borderlands, transcultural, transnational identity has been emerging globally. It is not for Iran, it is not for India, it's not for China. It is a kind of global problem or global movement, a global phenomena that we should accept it. And we cannot escape from this situation because they know that what to do in that new situation. And this new this understanding is, it means that it's a kind of the communication, having a relationship. If they want to have a communication, if they want to have understanding, they should able to adapt themselves with new situation and with new home. Have clearly cleared new diasporic discourses. Discourses are so important for us because they want to have a communication and understanding. If they can have understanding and communication, that time they will be have better relationship with other people, with the society, and maybe they be more successful in these situations. And this constituent settlement of the people given territory to can perhaps be seen alongside post-colonialism as a label back, perhaps yet another discourse that historicizes the modern migrant and has come to signify everything within this framework that is so difficult to define. How we can define this new frames, new structures, new social situations for new identities. They search for identities, search for quiz for new identities. This quiz can be so difficult for any kind of definition, and this can be a new situation that they should adapt themselves with it. This frame that is difficult, as I said, difficult to define, diasporic, and due to this, diasporic writing assert a sense of belonging to a locality. They never forget their own past, their own home, the first land, okay? In which post-colonial subjects have grown up and at the same time expresses the actual historical experience being ethnic in particular society of immigration. One can perhaps rather speak of some sort of identity, a kind of identity, a kind of the new form of literary migrants back to their emotive home countries. They always can't with their mother tongue. They, for example, they have migrated to United States, but whenever they want to count numerical ones, they count with their mother tongue, and they cannot forget it because they have a kind of the belonging to it. This migrating between individual post-colonial countries cause diaspora literature are a kind of the stories of imaginings and outsiderness of racism, because it's one of the most important difficulties that we have in other countries, that migrants in that countries, in new countries, at a new home, are faced with a racial discrimination, religious discrimination, political discrimination, or financial discrimination, because they are new, they are strange, and often haunted by ghosts of past generations, because they cannot be understood. Nobody understands them. And their unwritten stories, step by step, comes to become a kind of the diasporic literature and make new situation for new understanding, for new concept, for new context, with new forms and styles of the writings. Sometimes they want to express themselves, express their own secrets. What kind of the problems they had in their past that forced them to immigrate to new place. Much of this made the 1990s writing highlight instabilities and hidden agendas within transcultural subjectivity in the diasporic literature, I mean. Sometimes this diaspora writing is a kind of the quiz for returning to home. Most of them have this desire, this wish, this a kind of illusion, we can say in negative form, that they want to return to their home, and their home at reality is their real world, and this new world is their kind of the promised land. Maybe they cannot meet their own wishes and desires in new land, in the promised land. To home and real words, means of home is always surrounded by a kind of the quest for identity. This quest for identity can be one of the most important elements of their life. If you remember, and I'm sure you know that, Edward Said's the notion of exile is also a kind of the vein of most of the time about Jewish, of course. Jewish catastrophic tradition foregrounds it on old practice of the banishment. They suppose that this kind of the movement, this kind of the diasporic life, can be a kind of the traditional form of the banishment, a kind of the old curse that comes from Jesus Christ for Jews, that they have no land, no home, okay, and always they should be wandered. But here, it is a kind of, we can find a kind of the trace, a kind of trace of the banishment and punishment in this kind of the movement, because they are forced for this kind of the movement, and this kind of the movement has a kind of the challenge for their identity, and this is so important for them. Of course we have, we have so many works about this one, but another work is that they search for a landmark in process of the codify action. Any kind of the action they do, they try to codify them, find a situation, new situation for adapting themselves with this new situation, new circumstances, new society that they are forced to move in. Unlike above mentioned diaspora critics, or who elaborate a number of diasporic configuration, just like Jewish generations or Jewish nationalities, identity, Iranians, Turkish, Chinese, all of them make a kind of modern form of movement for finding of new structures and frames for their living. It's this kind of structure moving can be searching, as I said, for a kind of identity. The identity they try to find it. Clifford, another one that I always try to emphasize on his words, adds that diasporic cultures work to maintain community, selectively preserving and recovering of traditions. If you go to Society of Iranians, society in United States or in German or in the UK, you can find that they try to keep their structures. They try to keep their own customs, old customs, something like Nowruz, something like we say that Yalta night as the longest night of the year. Iranians celebrate them, and because it is a kind of keeping of society, keeping of their customs and traditions that are connected with their identity. This identity cannot be violated, cannot be forgotten. And as I said, Clifford, these diasporic cultures maintain community selectively preserving and recovering these traditions and customizing their in novel and often it's a kind of the nostalgic situation that he qualifies his thinking by arguing that diaspora cultures are to varying degrees produced by regimes of political dominations, economic inequality. Diasporic community, generally speaking, process of number of characteristics, regardless of their location. We shouldn't consider their location, their place and home. We should consider their real situation that they live in new place. And this new place can be a kind of the new identity, as I said. If we consider the novel that I want to speak about it, if I have more time, Children of the Cassandra Tree, this is a symbolic story that we should consider that how this story is a kind of gender-based, because the writer is an Iranian lady who had immigrated when in her childhood, and now she tries to write it in another language, his own experience, her own experiences about the situation that after 1979 Islamic revolution that we had in Iran. And we should consider this story an allegorical and symbolic story about the feeling of the diaspora. It's kind of the search for identity, a gender-based, of course. It is a feministic story by a female writer after Iranian postmodern situation that we have after, revolution, Islamic revolution. And during we call it imposed war. And in West, and maybe you call it the first Gulf War. All of them connected to each other for making new form of the identity for Iranian migrants. Anybody who have tried to move from his or her own country to new place for finding of the new situation, security, safety, maybe welfare, and maybe sometimes escaping from the any kind of the political, religious, and social situation that they have. They wanted to have new personality in new place. But as I said, as Clifford said, they couldn't do this because always recovering our traditions, always remembering their own past, own tradition, own customs. And because of this, they always are Iranian. They always are gender-based Iranian writers that tries to show their own real personality. This classical, we should remember this classical diaspora of the theoretical framework focus on ethnic representation of the reason and condition of diaspora, traumatic, because we have a pain, we have suffering, traumatic pain and traumatic past and connections with homelands. We cannot count with, you cannot find any literary text that has been cut from its own past, from own identities. It also considers on integration issues in house societies, in United Kingdom, in United States, in other countries, in European countries, in all of them, they are connected. These elements are completely connected to each other. Analyzing relationship between Iranians and their new surroundings. For example, as Sahar Dalijani that I chose, her novel, postmodern, gender-based, feministic novel that about post-war, about the post-revolutionary situation that we had in Iran, it shows that we have a kind of new narration, new identity. And one of the critics, as Futuhi, examines how literature born of Iranian diaspora can reflect social, political realities in new situation, new world. And this is the first of this kind, as well as those diaspora interested in culture, history of the Middle East. It's a kind of the mirror, can show what has happened because of any reasons, because of any situation that we had in Middle East, not in Iran, in all of the Middle East area. Diaspora in view of the Clifford, as I said, and as we are going to apply it in Sahar Dalijani's Kachandra tree, Children of the Kachandra tree, is a diasporic view involved dwelling, maintaining communities, have collective homes away from home. And this is completely different. This displacement completely different from exile. It is they are not forced to move. They wanted to move. They wanted to displace their home. They wanted to put their home and go to another land, okay, and made new. And this causes new discourses. Of course, in this novel, discourses, feministic discourse, gender-based discourse that reflect sense of being a part of going transnational network that includes homeland, not as something simply left. They couldn't simply left and cut and forget their own past and find the new ones. They try to have new situations, new conditions, new. They wanted to meet their own desires and wishes, but sometimes they fail. As I said, the important aspects of the Clifford definition of diaspora, as you know, which completely differ from exile and diaspora and immigration, is not exile. Diasporic understanding of homeland signifies not a place of return, but source of shifting. We should remember this, that this source of shifting, ambivalent and attachment. In this sense, past serves as a common base for diverse communities, as we had in this novel, Saaderi John's novel, that shows that this common base for diverse communities to connect. They try to connect. They try to have a communication with these situations. And this approach of diasporic positioning contrasts with the traditional definition of the diaspora, in which construction of the collective suffering, as I said, it is a kind of the trauma. It's a kind of the pain, because they wanted to cut from their homeland, and urge to return to national homeland remain central in all of the texts, literary texts that we have in a diasporic situation. In 1980s, exilic identity for large of Iranian diaspora was core factor in establishing an extended yet exclusive form of transnational network. Since then, patterns of identity within this community have shifted toward more inclusive network as a result of those transnational. We should remember this is a kind of the transnational situation and connection that leading to more extensive and intensive connections and activities between Iranian diaspora and Iranians in the country, the homeland country in Iran. As with any diaspora group, Iranian diaspora is quite diverse. This diversity includes religious background, Muslim, Jews, and Christians, because it is, you know that Iran is a multinational country. Political background, leftist, nationalist, and monarchist, because of the situation that we have before revolution. Okay, social class, education, gender, and new generations. Because new generations try to have new identity, and this new identity try to have a new home, new medium, new situation to express themselves. And this new generation always a kind of the rebellion and a kind of generation that always tries to violate and innovate new terms for expressing themselves. I have some other examples. I don't know how much I have a time.
Isn't fair almost over, but if that is important, you could say it, if that is important.
Okay, if it's time over, I am at your service. Because I wanted to express some examples. May I continue or finished? Time is over.
I mean, you could make it somewhat.
Just one examples and finish. One of the examples of the modern, postmodern Iranian diaspora is a novel, namely Moonlight and Avenue, of face traces of history of Iranian Jewish mothers, and doubts through the troubled relationship between Lily and her mother Roxana, told lyrically and in poetic language. And this novel takes us from Tehran Jewish community to LA in United States, enhancing a story by granting her characters magical power. And another example that I want to emphasize on this is from Manuche Parvin's, we say Dardedel, means expressing of the secrets. Okay, it's a kind of the reincarnation. It's so allegorical, so symbolic one that one of the so symbolic and allegorical stories that you can find that it's a kind of philosophical story, philosophical postmodern novel about reincarnation of the two great Iranian poets, Hafiz and Rumi. And it's a love, it's a kind of the love in New York. And it's a novel in verse. And this is a wonderful, light-hearted account of the Rumi and Hafiz reincarnation as a modern day New Yorkers. When Professor Piruz, as a main character, a lonely academic Iranian background in the United States, and a recurring character in Parvin's work, decides to commit suicide. He travels to the desert and confesses his problem as a Christian, tries to confess his problems. That time, what happens is that we face and we encounter with reincarnation of that two late poets, and he expresses his all of ideas, philosophies, and this story happens in this situation, completely philosophical, based on reincarnation, that you can allude to Jesus Christ, you can have allusion to other main philosophical and religious characters that happens in modern form. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks, Professor. There are a lot more questions. We are waiting into session, and we'll deal with that in the questions session. So, and thanks, okay. And next we have Professor Supradeep Dasgupta, who is an assistant professor from North Bengal University in Kolkata. And he's dealing with this theoretical question, which is also part of our discussion today, newer trends in literary theory, and he's dealing with the subject of the beyond the culture of voices, rereading modernism of the interface of Marxism and Freudian psychoanalysis. So this is a very complex question, but I think he will handle it in that such a lucid way. Welcome, sir.
Okay. Just give me a second. Let me try and start my video.
Oh, okay.
Please let me know if I am visible as well as audible.
Yes, it's visible and the audio is clear.
Okay, okay. Thank you, Mr. Abdul. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers and also Collins for giving me this opportunity to speak, to share my views on something in this webinar. And it was a pleasure listening to Professor Wagner, Professor Tariq Mahmoud Ali, and Professor Kishkar. Very enriching, enlightening talks from you. So yes, let me see if I can share my screen. Is it visible? Please let me know.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So, as you can see, the title of my proposed talk is Beyond the Culture of Verses, Rereading Modernism at the Interface of Marxism and Freudian Psychoanalysis. Whereas the theme of the webinar is Voices from Peripheries, New Trends in Literature and Theory. Now, I am a little skeptical about the use of the word periphery, and I am not sure whether what I say today will be counted as a peripheral voice, because what is the periphery, then what is the center? We are always in a state of flux regarding this. But as it comes to new trends in literature and theory, even there, at least apparently, when I propose a reading of modernism, or maybe some significant moments from what we understand as modernism in literature and arts, then also apparently I am not dealing with something that can be labeled as new. After all, modernism, historically speaking, is not something very new to us. But I hope that in the course of my talk today, it will become evident. I mean, I will be able to justify the title in the scheme of this webinar. Now, as to why I will talk about modernism. Now, we know that historically speaking, modernism had a historical beginning and arguably a historical end also, sometime around the mid 20th century. But even then, why modernism? Regarding that, a very recently published book, there Michael Levinson is of the opinion, and I hope the slide is visible to all of you. I have picked up a quote from Michael Levinson. He writes, "A temptation much indulged in recent years has been to dance beyond the reach of the aging, dying giant that is modernism, to prove that one can live past the epoch marked by such names as Joyce and Woolf, Pound and Eliot, Eisenstein and Brecht, Freud and Marx. Certainly, many forces have joined to change the vectors of late 20th century culture, but our contemporary imperative to declare a new period and to declare ourselves citizens of a liberated postmodernism has badly distorted and sadly simplified the moment it means to surface." So what Levinson proposes here, or what he tries to argue here, is probably somewhere, somehow in our zeal to claim ourselves, to declare ourselves as belonging to a post-modern era, maybe there are moments when we are assuming a sort of a very reductionist reading and hence a very distorted reading of what we consider as modernism and what we consider to have left behind us. That is what propels me, or many like me, to keep rereading moments from modernism. Now, I will assume that everybody present here in the audience, we are all very familiar with the idea of modernism. Now, if we look at modernism, the transition from the 19th to the 20th century, we will see that this is a very turbulent period. I use the word turbulence because on the one hand, we see that there was this steady rise in industrialization and a kind of a monopoly of capitalism. Along with that, as if almost like a corollary, we also find issues such as massive unemployment, frequent economic depressions marking the very beginning years of the 20th century, and not to mention the First World War, 1914 to 1918, the ravages, the carnages of the First World War. Along with that, what I also feel equally important is even before this 20th century was able to get familiar with its own name, it was faced with a massive intellectual challenge from some very significant ideas by some very significant people in the second half of the 19th century. For instance, we can mention people like Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Friedrich Nietzsche, and by the turn of the century, there is already Sigmund Freud, and definitely towards the very beginning years of 20th century, we have two very significant names in science, that is Max Planck and Albert Einstein. So what happens as a result of this transition from the 19th to the 20th century is fraught with a lot of tension, with a lot of anxiety. And maybe this is one reason why we find somebody like T.S. Eliot coming up with an observation of this sort. Here is a very significant quote from T.S. Eliot's The Metaphysical Poets. I will read it out. He writes, and I quote, "Poets in our civilization, as it exists at present, must be difficult. The poet must become more and more comprehensive, more elusive, more indirect, in order to force, to dislocate, if necessary, language into its meaning." So what becomes of immense significance to me from this observation by Eliot is he's talking about how the conventional modes of artistic expression are no more adequate to make meaning of existence as life has unfolded itself during this transition from the 19th to the 20th century. The language meaning equation that also cannot hold our sensibilities, our quote unquote modern sensibilities. So what he's also talking about, and we can also understand that a violence is palpable in this quotation from T.S. Eliot. A kind of a creative violence also marks this period. And if I can mention how I won't take time exploring on these ideas, just a brief. For instance, Gertrude Stein, how she discards the stylistic propriety to liberate, to release new rhythms in language itself. Or, for instance, somebody like Antonin Artaud, who comes up with a new language of theater that is called the theater of cruelty, and he howls loud, "No more masterpieces." Or James Joyce, who trains himself to scorch the culture that has nurtured him. So everywhere, a creative violence was very much palpable. It is in such an ambience of creative violence that we find in the year 1917, in the city of Paris, two plays were staged. The first one, if you can see the screen, the first one was basically, it's a ballet named Parade by Eric Satie. This ballet Parade consisted also of a one-act scenario written by Jean Cocteau, the very significant French poet Jean Cocteau, and the set and costume was designed by Pablo Picasso. Now, when this play was staged, or this ballet was staged, one person among the audience was the very famous French poet Apollinaire. Apollinaire made certain observations after watching this ballet in the year 1917. I will come to that just a few moments later. Before that, this is another picture from the second play I was talking about that was staged, that was premiered in 1917 in Paris. It was written by Apollinaire himself. The name of this play was The Breasts of Tirisius. Now, what happened while Apollinaire watched Parade, or when he wrote, or when his own play, The Breasts of Tirisius, was staged, Apollinaire felt that the experience is entirely new, something so new that cannot be expressed using the existing vocabulary, the existing set of words that we have. And for that, Apollinaire felt that we need to create or invent some new word. And in the same year, 1917, he writes a letter to one of his friends, a Belgian poet, Paul Darmy. And there he writes, all things considered, I think, in fact, it is better to adopt surrealism than supernaturalism for this kind of plays. And this is how the word surrealism was coined by Apollinaire. And what I propose to do in today's talk is pick up this particular moment, the surrealism and see through surrealism how it operates at the interface of Marxism and Freudian psychoanalysis. Now, the term surrealism was coined by Apollinaire in the year 1917, and 2 years later, we find that in Paris itself, a new magazine is started by people like Breton, André Breton, Louis Aragon, two very prominent poets of that period, by the name, and the name of that magazine is Literature. And there they start publishing, they start printing certain writings, certain poems and kinds of novels that are very removed from the familiar kinds of, the kinds of poems or novels that the audience was familiar, the readers were familiar with. So what I want to say is, by the year 1919, through this magazine, the Literature, this surrealist kind of writing was already in practice. Though surrealism as an official, the official status of surrealism had to wait for another 4 or 5 years, because in the year 1924, we find André Breton coming up with the Manifesto of Surrealism, a very famous, very talked about piece of literature, the Manifesto of Surrealism. It comes out in 1924, and this is when surrealism as a distinct movement or a perspective or a philosophy gains an official status, sort of. Here I have quoted André Breton from the Manifesto of Surrealism, which also tells us what the surrealists strived to achieve, what they wanted to achieve. And I quote Breton from the manifesto. He writes, they want to achieve pure psychic automatism by which one proposes to express, either verbally, in writing, or by any other manner, the real functioning of thought. Dictation of thought in the absence of all control exercised by reason outside of all aesthetic and moral preoccupation. So why I choose this particular quote from the manifesto? See, he proposes an exercising of the real functioning of thought. So it is assumed that the real functioning of thought is not possible so far in the conventional modes of expression in literature or in other forms of art. The real functioning of thought is so far not possible. And also, so what they want to do is exercise pure psychic automatism so that the real functioning of thought becomes possible. And what is keeping them from exercising this real functioning of thought? What is the hindrance? What is the barrier? That also Breton answers here. These are concepts, ideas, thoughts like reason, aesthetics, morality. So what I feel or what I propose is Breton is actually bringing in two very significant domains of thought into this very brief quote that I have mentioned here. On the one hand, we have the domain of the unconscious, under which I have kept this idea of the pure psychic automatism that he talks about, whereby there can be a real functioning of thought. And we should remember that he is writing it in the year 1924. So by then, Sigmund Freud and his ideas, his theorization of the unconscious was already very, very significant. There was already a good reception of the Freudian thoughts, and Breton was very well read in the Freudian ideas, Freudian psychoanalytic theorizations. On the other hand, ideas like reason, aesthetics, morality, they definitely fall under what we consider as ideology. So what Breton is doing in this quote that we have seen is bringing the two very significant thinkers of who are being received at that time, One is Sigmund Freud and the other is Karl Marx. And quite interestingly, what forms a very significant part of my proposition today also, he shows a relation not of versus. Because often there is a reductionist view regarding Marx, that Marx, whatever Marx tells is regarding the society, regarding the social, regarding the community, whereas whatever Freud tells is regarding the individual. And there is often this tendency, this trend of positing Sigmund Freud in antagonism to Marx. But Andre Breton, his manifesto, or the manner in which the surrealists try to view surrealism, this perspective, this philosophy, that is going beyond this culture of versus. They are more like bringing Freud and Table to the same table and make Freud and Marx engage in a conversation with each other. Now I will pick up the idea of ideology, the notion of ideology. Now just a brief recalling of what ideology means to us and how it becomes significant here. This term was coined originally by the Enlightenment thinker De Tracy in the year 1796. But De Tracy, when he coined this term ideology, he tried to mean ideology more as a science of ideas. Now he was an Enlightenment thinker, and in keeping with this Enlightenment championing of reason and rationalism, he also tries to look at ideology as a science, a method, a rational way of looking at ideas and their genesis. But the Marxist understanding, which is a more radical and to us a more acceptable understanding of what ideology means, a Marxist, if we look at the Marxist understanding, then we can say that for Marx, I have already quoted, I have also mentioned two quotes from Karl Marx here. I will come to them later. For Karl Marx as well as the subsequent Marxists, ideology refers to simply a set of ideas that help the ruling class or the dominant class in the society to maintain the status quo. Why maintain the status quo? So that the mechanism of exploitation that can be in practice, that is not disturbed. The dominant class can remain in a position of domination, and the exploited class will remain in the position of being exploited. And ideology is a set of ideas that serve that purpose. That is in very simple words, a Marxist understanding or the radical understanding regarding ideology. And here, let's look at the quotes from Karl Marx himself. The first one is from the very famous German ideology. Karl Marx, along with Friedrich Engels, writes, "The ideas of the ruling class are in any age the ruling ideas." So ideology originates, it's not any science, it's not a rational way of looking at ideas, rather these are sets of ideas originating from the ruling class. And the second one, the class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production. So this is almost an echoing of what he writes in the German ideology. Now, a subsequent Marxist, a very significant Marxist, one of the early Marxists also, Antonio Gramsci, in the 1920s, preferred to look at ideology as a terrain. He gives this very significant concept of ideology as a space, a field, a terrain of practices, principles, and dogmas having a material and institutional nature. And what becomes very significant, what Gramsci hints at, is that the moment an individual, a human being, an individual, is inserted into that terrain of practices, principles, and dogmas, that is into the terrain of ideology, the moment an individual is inserted into the terrain, that individual is transformed, is converted into a subject. This very idea of transformation of the individual into the subject, the formation of subject, is also dealt with very beautifully by a subsequent Marxist like Louis Althusser. Okay, especially in his work Lenin and Philosophy and other essays, he talks extensively about what is ideology and how individuals are always already subjects. We can assume that we are individuals, but at the end of the day, basically we are all subjects. And why not? Because often, either consciously or unconsciously, we often utter words like subjective, subjectivity. So as we assume that an individual at the individual plane, at the individual level, we are all subjects. We seldom remember that by subject, we mean that we are actually subject to something. We are subjugated to something superior. Actually, what happens when we are transformed from individuals into subjects, we become subject to the ideology of our space and time. And this has very beautifully been dealt with by Michel Foucault, one of the very significant thinkers of post-structuralism or postmodernism, how you like to view it, Michel Foucault. And again, here is another quote, a very significant quote from Michel Foucault. He writes, "Power that applies itself to immediate everyday life categorizes the individual, marks him by his own individuality, attaches him to his own identity, imposes a law of truth on him that he must recognize and others have to recognize in him. It is a form of power that makes individuals subjects." I repeat, he writes, "It is a form of power that makes individuals subjects." There are two meanings of the word subject: subject to someone else by control and dependence, and tied to his own identity by a conscience, what we understand as conscience or self-knowledge. Both meanings suggest a form of power that subjugates and makes subject to. So as I was telling you, the subject formation, this transformation, this journey from individual to subject, and according to Althusser, an individual is always already a subject. That means in this ideological setup, any society, every class-based society, class-divided society is also guided by certain ideologies. And ideologies, remember, ideologies are best at work when we, at the quote-unquote individual level, feel that there is no ideology that guides us. That means ideologies are best operating at that point of time. Okay. Now, Foucault prefers to use the word power here. I rather would use the word ideology. It is ideology that subjugates us, that colonizes our mind, so to say. We are not at liberty. Our mind is no more at liberty. To get back to the same quote by André Breton in the Manifesto of Surrealism now, see, I have highlighted something that is the dictation of thought in the absence of all control. And in this same manifesto, he also mentions that the mere word freedom is the only one that still excites me. It doubtless satisfies my only legitimate aspiration. So what becomes significant for us is that Breton, or the Surrealists, so to say, the Surrealist movement on a whole, tried to work for a liberty of the mind, because they felt that our mind is not at liberty. Even when we feel that we are at liberty, actually we are subject to some superior power, some external as well as internal control. Okay. Now, So how to achieve this freedom? How to achieve this liberty of the mind? Now, Breto himself was a devoted Marxist. That is why he's talking about this liberty. Or the Surrealists, they were very familiar with the Marxist philosophy of that period. So they are talking about liberty, but how to achieve? What can be the technique? This is where Sigmund Freud comes into the frame. Now, in a form of just brushing up our memory regarding how Freud tries to map the human psyche, it has been contested later, but if we are talking about the 1920s, 1930s, this picture of an iceberg, we are all familiar how this model of iceberg helps us understand the map of the human psyche that is proposed by Sigmund Freud, where the visible part, the small visible part, is the realm of the conscious, our conscious thoughts and perceptions. And the large invisible part is the realm of the unconscious. And there is also a preconscious level, which we can consider as memories or stored knowledge that we can have access to. We do not have ready knowledge of that, but whenever we feel like, we can get access to those knowledges. That is preconscious level. But the bulk of our humans, of our psyche, is remains in the domain of the unconscious, something that is not accessible. And what remains in the unconscious is our sexual and aggressive instincts, according to Freud, our fears and anxieties, the unacceptable sexual desires, irrational wishes, immoral urges, shameful and traumatic experiences. So note here, something that is unacceptable, something that is considered not moral, something that is not considered ethical, something that is not considered rational, such wishes, such desires, such thoughts are all pushed by our superego to the realm of the unconscious, which is not accessible to us. Why? So that the society can perform smoothly the status quo that I was talking about earlier, that can be maintained. Because if these elements that are pushed to the realm of the unconscious, if they were allowed to remain at the level of the conscious, they would create a great bit of disturbance for the society to maintain its balance, quote unquote, to maintain its status quo. And as Freud describes the unconscious, it is more like a domain, a vast reservoir or a cauldron of our hidden desires and wishes. Now, what the Surrealists felt was we need to get access to this unconscious, because unlike the pre-Freudian era, people in the 1920s or the 1930s no more considered the unconscious to be something entirely imaginary. Rather, they felt that the unconscious is also a part of the self, that part of the self which is no more accessible to the self that I am conscious of. I hope I am not getting too complicated, too complex. So in order to get a better understanding of myself, I need to get access to this reality. I need to get access to this unconscious. How can I get access to the unconscious? Because Freud has already theorized and showed us that the unconscious is the realm that is not accessible to the conscious level of the mind. This is where the Surrealists again take aid of another Freudian technique. This Freudian technique is the concept of free association. And quite parallel to the Freudian technique of free association, the Surrealists develop a technique of writing that they name as automatic writing. By, as I was telling you, that magazine Literature, the French magazine Literature, that was full of writings that the surrealists claimed to be examples of automatic writing. In fact, Breton came up with a novel using this style of automatic writing. And I would also like to inform you that somebody like W.B. Yeats, William Butler Yeats, also practiced this automatic writing and wrote an entire book which was published in the year 1925 named A Vision, which Yeats, who was not a surrealist, but he tried his hand in automatic writing and wrote a book named Vision. So automatic writing, this technique used the Freudian concept of free association. Now, what is free association? All of us are probably familiar with this idea of free association. Actually, in free association, what happens? A person who feels that I need to go and visit a psychologist or a psychoanalyst or a psychiatrist, they go and visit this specialist, the professional, and this psychoanalyst, they will, using their own professional expertise, the psychoanalyst will try to provide this patient, this person, a very soothing, a relaxed ambience, full of what I can call a non-judgmental acceptance, where this person, the visitor, she or he can open herself or himself up and share anything and everything that crosses their mind without the slightest concern regarding coherence, regarding rationality, regarding what is acceptable, what is unacceptable, what is moral, what is ethical. They do not need to think about all those things. Okay. So what the specialist, the professional psychoanalyst will do, using their expertise, they will provide such an ambience where this person can be stripped of all these ideological constraints that are guiding or dominating the person. And in a liberated ambience, they can open up and they come up with their images from their dreams, certain sleeps, certain accidental moments that will help this specialist develop a proper understanding, a better understanding of the psyche of this person. Because as I was telling you, these ideological constraints always keep a huge part of our psyche beyond the scope of our own reach. So in order to gain access to that domain of the unconscious, the psychoanalyst, the Freudian psychoanalyst, will use the technique of free association, and the surrealists develop a parallel technique of automatic writing, whereby, as Breton also writes elsewhere, that what they propose to do is pick up moments from dream, pick up moments from certain, what we consider as slippages, certain accidental moments, and converge them with our lived reality. This is very important. Breton talks about picking up certain moments from the dream and converging with it with our lived reality. So he is bringing the two extreme opposites, lived reality and the dream, and converging the two to create what he calls a kind of a superior liberty. Sorry, a superior reality. And definitely this is a superior reality than the conventional modes of expression could afford at that point of time. Because the conventional modes of expression at that point of time, they always dealt only with the visible apparent part of reality. What lies beyond that, that was never taken into account, because that was beyond the reach, beyond access. Now, what surrealism does by converging lived realities along with dreams and accidental slippages is create a kind of superior reality. So that is why I mention here, they propose a reality which is in a way more real than what we consider as realism. Hence, they use the word surrealism. a superior realism. Now, this is another quote by another very prominent surrealist, the Belgian poet Paul Nouge. Now, Paul Nouge is a very important Belgian poet of the 1930s, 40s, 50s, but at the same time, he is also one who brought surrealism to Belgium. Okay. And he writes, it is not enough to create an object. It is not enough for it to be. We must show that it can, by some artifice, arouse in the spectator the desire, the need to see. So what Paul Nouge wants to mean by this need to see, this act of seeing, is not some passive act of seeing. Rather, what he proposes here is a new kind of seeing on part of the audience or the reader, a new kind of interpretation of reality on part of the reader or on part of the audience, whereby they will interpret reality in such a manner that will trigger a desire to transform that reality. So what I'm saying is, Paul Nouge proposes that the surrealist object, now we can also talk at length about surrealist object, but right now, due to time constraint, we cannot get into a detailed conversation regarding that. Okay, the surrealist object, it can be a piece of poetry, it can be a piece of sculpture, anything that should arouse a desire in the audience or the reader to see, to look, to interpret in such a way that they will interpret reality in a manner that will trigger a desire to transform that reality, because they are being exposed to a kind of superior reality that I was talking about just a few moments back. And this saying by Paul Nouge reminds me immediately of probably the most quoted observation by Karl Marx that he mentions in his thesis on Feuerbach. Probably this is the most quoted statement by Karl Marx. Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Somewhere the surrealists, through their art, through their poetry, through their literary works, they are also trying to give us such kinds of works that will trigger this zeal, this desire in us to transform the reality that we are living in. I have come towards the end of my talk, and surrealism is nothing that can be considered as a dead concept, because we are carrying elements, traits, views in us from surrealism even today. And maybe that is a reason that makes somebody like Walter Benjamin, a postmodernist, so to say, become so fascinated, and he uses this word fascination for surrealism, so fascinated with surrealism that he writes, and this is a quote from Walter Benjamin, then he writes, in his opinion, since Bakunin, that is Mikhail Bakunin, the Soviet anarchist, social anarchism comes from Mikhail Bakunin, since he writes, since Bakunin, Europe has lacked a radical concept of freedom. So over 100 years, Europe has lacked a radical concept of freedom. The surrealists have won. So with my talk, thank you for listening.
Thanks, Professor Supradeep Dasgupta, for such a mesmerizing talk dealing with the interplay, the crossroads of theory, of literary theory between apparently different theories, apparently antagonistic theories, but looking seemingly, but it seems now they are too connected. So without lapsing into anything, if I can remind our audience today that they could this is a certificate program. So we'll post the feedback link in the comment section. So is in fact it would be enabled for 1 hour from after the talk, and so they could fill the feedback feedback form so that they could avail the certificates. So this is the way they should do for availing the certificates. So I think we could go on to the interesting, anxiously awaiting questions and sections. So we are in fact streaming this via YouTube, and we have questions there too. So one of the question is in fact a director asked at Professor Brian Wagner. One of the students is asking, he has come up with news of some unidentified tribal people in the American continent. They are in fact using the music, the traditional cultural presentations to make to spread awareness about COVID-19. So this is something they have been. So they are making use of their jazz music and other music cultures to make aware of the people of the dangers, the cautions they need to do about the COVID-19. So he's asking about something more about that. He has came up with this.
Yeah, it's not a situation or a people that I'm aware of, but that's very interesting to know. It's based in. Did the question indicate where or who was being referenced? But it is interesting to know about these performances and these people. Is there any more information about who the questioner is referring to?
Yes, not referred to anything. I mean, I have to come up with this thing, and I think it's something like Mwanga tribe identified.
Okay. Well, that's very interesting to know that. I'm not aware of the particular of the situation there.
Sure, I would. In fact, if I came up with that, I would send it to you. So it's
Thank you.
So there is another question. I think is to Professor Tariq Mahmood. Student is asking about means there are many similar cultures, many similar traditions being seen among many colonized countries, especially in the resistant literature. So he's asking, she's asking whether it's because of their colonized past, whether it's because they are subjected to colonizers, that they have many similar traditions. So she's referring to the works of Chinua Achebe, the Things Fall Apart is a poem. She has come up with a similarity to her culture in that.
Well, yes, I'm familiar with the text. Of course, there are similarities between people who suffered colonialism, but there are also similarities. We don't have to look too far in the past to find the legacies. In India, it is very much alive with the movement of the Hindutva process. In Pakistan, it is very much alive in terms of the whole Islamization and the wiping out of indigenous cultures. Now, the question that faces progressive people, what do we do? Do we simply accept that the regimes that rule us, they have the right to decide on who we are, what we do? No, we don't. They only exist, in a sense, to serve their own interests. So my answer to you is that the legacy of colonialism is not necessarily all about divisions amongst us. There are many points on which we united as well. And the history of Africa and Asia is awash with needs of people to use culture as a weapon to fight against their oppressors. And in this, stories and literature, poems and film and music and a whole plethora of whatever we have were always used as tools for not only trying to understand, but to change the reality that they were confronted with. And language in that sense was one of the most important ones, for we must speak. As human beings, we have a set number of minimum requirements. First and foremost is the right to life. And then have that life as a life of dignity. And how do we perceive that life? Should we have to live in somebody else's nightmare to be able to dream our own dreams? Or should we be able to dream our dreams in our language, or languages not imposed from above, but that we've taken by force when they've been taken back by force when they've been forcibly taken from us, or held on to those that we were about to lose? Where do we go? How do we do it? These are challenges of our times.
Sure. And there is another question again, directed at Professor Tariq Mahmood. There is such a tendency in our lives, in our parents, asking ourselves to be a master, to master the English language, and to master the Western culture, especially among. He is referring to the Middle East, also Middle East, especially the Arabian people. They are too mesmerized by the Western culture. So what do you think about this?
Well, firstly, there are two parts to that. One is, I am also South Asian, and I understand very much the pressures by parents for us to learn English. Now, they're not asking us to learn English because it sounds pretty. It's an economy. There are jobs to be had, money to be made, livelihood, status, and in some cases, marriage, and all sorts of things associated with the dominance of English. Now, I think that, we are at times stuck by the powers and processes that be. It's important to get knowledge in whatever language you can. My whole argument earlier on was that by denying mother tongue and imposing another language, just that act alone is a discriminatory act and an act of exploitation and injustice. And I can, of course, elaborate that by personal experience. Regarding the second point of mesmerization, actually, the Arab world, as you describe, is also full of resistance to Western domination, whether it be in Palestine, whether Iraq, whether Syria. It has never, ever stopped. One of the, I suppose, badkismati, the ill-fatedness of the region is that they didn't simply grow carrots. Unfortunately, they have oil and other things the West wants. So in a way, culture, history, economics, politics, they are not separable processes. So I don't think that everyone or masses of the Arab world are mesmerized and want to ape the white man. Let's put the cat in, open it. I don't think so. I think there are certain classes and certain economic needs that force us into that sort of a situation. Sometimes it's economic desperation. We want to go to the West. Why shouldn't we? The West doesn't belong to the Westerners. It's ours. They stole everything from us. Now, we just don't understand that at time because we think of our own economic and personal needs. So in my sort of thinking is that it is true that there are people who, and I have had many a student like that, who could not imagine, like I said earlier on, the value of their own stories. But separate yourself from your own story. You don't really exist. You can try to exist in somebody else's story, but you'll only be there as a punctuation.
Thanks, Professor. So Dr. Alfa Hussein is asking about is director at Professor Kian Pishka, I think he's there, about the third space of diasporic people, how they engage with them.
Can you repeat again your question?
She's asking about the third space of, is a bit not clear, but there is a destination and there is a motherland, but there would be something. She's asking about a third space of the diasporic people.
When we have a new placement for, as we call it, displacement or migration from one land to another, from one country to another country, we are going to have a new discourses, new communication, new relationship, and this needs a new kind of the ideas, new kind of the knowledge and understanding. If we consider these two with each other, this kind of the diasporic diverse can show itself clearly, and we can clarify that. And after that, we should find to where we are going to, to where we belong, spiritually and materially. If we can forget our country or our motherland, that time we are going to have new identity. But is it really possible? No. We cannot cut the past generation, past our background. And now we are going to find a new situation, new condition in new ones. So because of this, these migrants, these people who try to have a displacement, have a new kind of identity, and they try to adjust themselves with this new situation. It is a kind of spiritual quest. If we consider this quest, it needs a new kind of the discourses and new linguistic, new kind of the language for expressing ourselves. And this new language, new linguistic forms and styles have been expressed in literature, diasporic literature. And because of this, when we study this literature, we should have a new idea with that new view about analyzing of these structures. Because of this, I tried to consider this kind of the globalized, because it is a globalized situation, this globalized diaspora and female or gender-based situation in Iranian after revolution and after imposed our 80 years war with Iraq. This made new situation and forced more than 8 million people to move from Iran because of any reason, okay? And they had new kind of identity. But in this identity, they try to express themselves. And this expressing is a kind of a new discourse that we should be analyzed carefully with in details for expressing and showing them to all of the world that what kind of diasporic language, diasporic literature can be formed in new postmodern situation.
And there is a build-up question. I think you could add. You could think about that too. She's asking, how does these identities emerging, whether it is by integration or assimilation, what's the devices?
This identity comes from quest for returning to home, and this it's a kind of the new form of the exile. Of course, it is a kind of the self-exile, as James Joyce had. It was his movement. It was a kind of the self-exile, and this identity comes from the search, from the quest for finding of themselves. The migrants try to find themselves because they search for new things, new place, new home, and based on this, they try to have a new identity. This identity maybe solve their problem, religious problems, political problems, financial problems, and if they can adjust themselves with other countries, and other people that they want to live there, that time they can solve their problem. But again, I emphasize this matter that they cannot forget their past. The past has been in their spirit, and they try to adapt themselves with new situation, with new home, and with this new structure that they are going to find. This, remember, this kind of the diasporas are not real one. It is a kind of symbolic, allegorical situation. Even in the real society, this is a kind of the imaginary. They suppose that they are again in dream, and it's not. They cannot meet the what really they wanted to find in their own migration. Okay, because of this, in their writing, in their discourses, we have trauma, we have pain, we have suffering, and they try to express what they try to express what they miss from their home.
Thanks, Professor. And there is one question from the YouTube streaming comment section. I think Professor Subradip Dusgupta could answer it. It's asking about there is a difference between the practical and theoretical section in literature. I mean, they are literary personalities, elite literary personalities who have not engaged in activism. And today we have many peripheral ones from Adivasi and other indigenous writers who are activists along with their literary works, producing literary works. So this is an old and always existing dichotomy binary between the theoretical elite and the practical peripheral ones. So how could we deal with that?
Sorry, sir, but I missed the bulk of what you were saying, maybe due to some kind of network issue. Is it written somewhere? I can't find it, the question.
It's from the YouTube comment section, so it's not here.
Can you, I'm sorry, but you will have to repeat in brief because I missed it.
There is this difference between the elite theory and practical, practical marginal ones. Means some people will deal with the theory, they want with literary works, they want gone to become activists. But we have today Adivasis and maybe many from writers from many indigenous communities who are activists too. So before we had elite writers who haven't engaged in activism. So this is a difference between writers not going on for practice, writers not going engaging in activism. So this is what I mean.
Well, I feel I'm audible, I hope. Yeah. What I feel in view of this question, or more of a kind of an observation, this is, see, who is an elite and who is not an elite? There is also a politics behind it, right? I mean, again, if we talk in terms of relativity, it is the subject's stance that makes somebody an elite and somebody not an elite. And I feel that this notion that these days we do not find the so-called elite writers or artists becoming activists, that is a little, I don't find much base in this, because we have to leave it at the end of the individual. I mean, it should be my call whether I want to engage in any kind of activism. Even there, what we count as activism, a person who is engaged in writing poems, getting books of poems published, and stopping there. He might say this is, or she might say that this is my part of activism. This is what I consider as activism. So it's not necessary that everybody will have to literally take onto the streets, onto the roads to be labeled as activists. And it is also, I don't think, a very welcome trend if anybody and everybody wants to become an activist. So there will always be a thin line dividing theorists from activists, though there is, of course, an overlapping of the two. Could I answer? Yes.
Yeah, that's good. And there is a last one. This is with this comes the end of discussion section. So this is last one. Someone is asking whether the indigenization of English out of its colonial stamps, its colonial characters is it that way? Means is the indigenization of English one of the ways of stripping it of its colonial stance? For instance, in Indian English has become more or less like a native language. So it's an indigenization of English. So how does the indigenization of English come? Whether it's by stripping the English language out of its colonial characters, colonial stamps. I think Professor Tariq or even Professor Brian could answer that.
I'm very happy for Brian to go, if not, then I'm happy to say a few words. Look, I think that when it comes to the question of language, there are no yes and no answers in these things. These are historical processes. Now, there are movements within India who believe, writers in particular, who believe that their languages, the Dalit writers who believe their languages have been Brahminicalized, if you like, or rather the stamp of oppression is there. There are those who believe that English, I certainly do, English has a specific class hierarchy within. Now, one thing for sure is that it's not a question so much of the indigenization of English, but giving the respect to the indigenous languages, giving them as the medium of education, does not mean the getting rid of English or Urdu or Hindi or any other language which because there is no contradiction in the language or the sound system itself. The problem is of society and who political processes serve. So I think that, a sword cuts. It in the hands of the master, it's a different thing. In the hands of the slave, it's a very different thing. So it depends where you see yourself in that relationship. But certainly it can be a medium of change, but it can also be a chain as well, as many people suffer trying to teach their children to speak in English and at the expense of the indigenous languages. And I think in conclusion, each time we lose a language, it's a little bit like losing a tree. We don't know what medicinal value that tree could have given us. Once it's gone, it's gone. And languages are the same. We don't know what else is lost when a language is lost, and many are being lost all the time. So my question is really slightly else. I speak English, I earn in English, I even teach English in a place like, not teach English, but teach in English in a place like Lebanon. So there are contradictions, you may think, in what I've been saying, and I think you would be right. So I don't know the answer is about simple indigenization of English, but certainly I don't think that should necessarily be the starting point of our conversation. That's not to say that we dump it and move in a different direction. That it is an historical process. It's not an individual thing. We have to live in the times that we live and change those times as we can, or change with the times if need be. But let's keep our feet on the grounds from which we were raised.
Thanks, Tariq. Again, Professor Brand could make a comment about this.
I'll just say very quickly that I agree with what's been said. I don't think it's a simple question. What would it mean, or how would one go about indigenizing English? I'm not sure, but there's no question that the need to value all the languages we're talking about is essential in schools. In the United States, it is very sadly the case that there are many parts of the country that are committed to a kind of monolingual culture and are impoverished as a result. To think about the horticultural metaphor that was just used, and so to the degree that it's possible, if indigenizing English means encouraging through schools, whatever means, thinking about English as one language among many, rather than a standard, that would seem to me a worthwhile and very, very important endeavor.
Thanks, Professor Brian. So with this question comes the end of our question and answer session. So it has been such an astonishing, such an wonderful session we have passed by, and I thank all of our attendees today, all of our audience, our guest speakers, especially is in fact speaking in such a circumstance. In fact, it's not that strange to speak to laptops today, but okay, is still a problem. But I really thank our guest speakers for their generosity, for attending this one, for taking time to give us their valuable words about their preferred topics. So once again, thanks. So we have, I think, Ms. Vidya Narayanan is here. She is the PR of Collins Publishers in India, and they have collaborated with us to conduct this program and to make this program more illuminating. I think Vidya Narayanan could make some comments.
Thank you, Mr. Abdul Fattah. It's wonderful being a part of this session today, and very, very insightful, I should say. And frankly speaking, I think I'm at a loss of words to actually express how wonderfully all the four speakers brought out the main essence of the topic, where they actually spoke about how we should not forget our roots, stay stuck to our roots, and then try and diversify it. So imbibing the best from everywhere, trying to inculcate that into our life, plus making sure that we take a lot of the positives and not just, stay stuck to one kind of a thought. And thank you so much for giving all of us these wonderful thoughts that we could carry forward, and that too from a language, and that too from talking about how the literature aspect of English has actually given us these nice thoughts. So it was wonderful being a part of you all today. And from Collins, it's thank you so much for having us on board here for the session. And thank you very much, and for this really, really, really thought-provoking session for us. Thanks a ton.
Thanks, Ms. Vidya. So if our audience, if they think that if there is something, some follow-up questions, I wish I could have asked that one, they could mail us, or they could text message us through WhatsApp and other facilities, and we'll pass to our guest speakers today. So programs comes to the end. I will hand over the session to Mr. Abdul Basit, who is the organizer. Welcome.
Thank you. Honorable guests, the chair and audience, a very good evening to one and all. It's been a month long. We were being through the various projects under ENG-AGE webinar on literature and theory. And finally, we are here on international webinar. I, on behalf of Jamia Madinat Noor and the entire supporting team, especially our director and guide, Dr. Ahmed Azhari Ustad, who couldn't reach us due to some technical errors. I'm very thankful to him and the technical crews and the associated organization Collins India And on my own behalf, I extend a very hearty word of thanks to all panelists for gracing your important work and sharing with us your findings and opinions on contemporary trends on English literature and theory. I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for Professor Brian Wagner for his explanation of his topic, Life and Legend of Fugitive Slave. Thanks, sir. Furthermore, we are grateful to Dr. Suryadeep Dasgupta for demonstrating his topic in much critical and analytical way. Thank you very much, sir. I would like to express our sincere thanks to Professor Tariq Mahmoud Ali for giving an excellent coverage for his topic, Decolonial Ideas. Thank you very much. And we also like to acknowledge our gratitude to Professor Kian Pishka for exposing a novel center for presentation. Thank you very much, sirs. We are all enriched by your great words and presentation. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to place on record our hearty thanks to our joint director of Madinatul Noor, Asaf Noorani Ustad, Zubair Noorani, Jafar Nizami from Australia, Abdurrahman Noorani from London, Lukman Sakafi, Suhail Noorani, and our technical wing head, Said Sahel Hydrosi, and Fatah Kur Ramesh for the perfect logistic support and guidance. And I also extend my thanks to the chair of the program, Mamdouh Abdul Fattah, and coordinators from Collins, India, Miss Vidya Narayanan, Sajivan Saab for the enormous cooperation in the organization of this event. Once again, thank you all for your kind participation throughout this program, and thank you. Have a nice day.